Story 1. I really do not care about anything other than it being a basic, usable device that offers decent value for money. If Apple's offering was in the same price range as an Android device, I might have picked one up, but as it is, I would rather not pay more for a device than I have to. Story 2. I have used Android all my life, so I do not see the point in changing. Despite what some people say, both iPhone and Android have perfectly good and usable phones. Story 3. I do not really vibe with Apple iOS. It is just not intuitive to me. I also do not like the price point of Apple iPhones. Story 4. Once you are in the iOS environment, it is hard to leave. Apple makes the integration of new products seamless. Story 5. It is familiar, and I am awful with technology, so changing things up after a decade of Apple sounds stressful and anxiety-inducing. Too long. Didn't read. I am incompetent, and change is scary. Story 6. I recently went back to the Android operating system, mainly because my Apple Watch finally stopped working, and that was the only reason I got the iPhone in the first place. I just prefer the Android operating system. Story 7. I like iPhones. I think the user experience and software are much more polished. I used to prefer Android phones because they were always much cheaper and I liked customizing them. However, now the price difference is negligible for phones I actually want to use. If you want a brand new ultra-budget phone, Apple does not offer one. I just want my device to work with as little hassle as possible. Story 8. Apple ecosystem. The iPhone acts as the gateway into it. Once you have the headphones, watch, laptop, and so on, they all work seamlessly together. Trying to get out of it is an expensive effort. Personally, I think Android is better because you have more control over your device, but the wider interconnectivity, such as with personal computers, is lacking. Story 9. I do not like the iPhone interface. Also, I have gone this long without any Apple products. Why change now? Story 10. I do not like how everything on the iPhone is smooth and round. I do not like the gray font it uses everywhere, and I strongly resent its status as the #1 consumer brand item. The whole green text and blue text distinction is enough to keep me permanently out of the Apple ecosystem. Story 11. The main reason I have an iPhone is Windows. Windows was a hot mess when Windows 7 came around, so I got a Mac. I also had an iPad at the time, and those two things were the solution I was looking for as a replacement for the Palm Pilot that Hewlett-Packard discontinued and the personal computer combination I used to enjoy. The Mac and iPad worked together in a way that the Palm never did. I didn't have to keep a docking cradle on my desk, and information updated over iCloud in real time. After a year or so, I got an iPhone, and it was the same thing, only now that information was in my pocket. The setup was basically just logging into iCloud with your Apple identification, and all your information is there. I also have a woman I live with, my wife. She is not naturally technically savvy, but she needed a tablet and a phone too, and the easiest thing to do was to get her an iPhone and iPad as well. It reduces the information technology work that needs to be done. Apple costs more than cheaper alternatives, but it is also less work. There is a difference between tinkering with things as a hobby and having to fix a problem with something you depend on. I am not saying Android is a problem. I am looking at Windows, in particular Linux somewhat, and the interoperability of all that software together. To me, a phone is a peripheral device and takes a backseat to a fully developed computer. It has never been about the phone. I just have the one that works well with my main devices. Story 12. I teach math. I teach students how to use the calculator they have access to. The iPhone calculator is backwards. This means if my student needs sine of 45 degrees, they have to type 45, then press sine. This is different from a normal calculator. When they write an answer on paper, they write 45 sine instead of sine of 45 because that is how they typed it into their calculator. Story 13. Ad blocking only works on Android. Also, iOS is a wild mix of excellent features and serious flaws. Interestingly, the complex parts are actually well designed, but the basics like updates or battery management are likely intentionally poor. Story 14. I was always an Android user but upgraded to an iPhone about 2 years ago because of a few features. Well, they were useless and that phone was absolute garbage. When Verizon finally offered me a good enough deal, I left that train wreck. iPhones have half the functionality at twice the price. They are pure status symbols. I will never go back. Story 15. Had iPhone since 3GS. Decided to try Android and got a Samsung Galaxy S24 and later a Google Pixel 9 Pro. I liked them, but something felt off. I could not really put my finger on it. It was weird. Something about the apps and software that felt not as optimized. After almost a year, I returned to my old iPhone to see if I missed anything from it and if I would miss anything from the Android phones. I am now back to my iPhone. I do not miss the Android devices. What I missed was how everything connects well with my other devices. But that is a bit of cheating considering I could not use that feature on the Android devices. I also like the camera app on iPhone so much more. Apps actually feel much smoother. Just the whole operating system honestly feels smoother. Story 16. Apple believes in a user's privacy and would stand firmly on that principle. Other companies would not be as willing to do so. Story 17. I had a MacBook first, then an iPod. When the iPhone came out, it seemed like a natural fit. Then came an iPad, an Apple Watch, and all the chargers and other proprietary accessories. The thing I have always liked about Apple products is they have always just worked for me, and they work well together. When one part fails, it gets replaced in kind. I would not switch to a whole new ecosystem. After more than 20 years, I am pretty much locked in, and I feel comfortable with that. Story 18. I like Apple because it just works very well. I am not interested in tweaking and customizing. I just want it to always work as intended. Story 19. I am paying £11 a month for an iPhone 13 with 100 gigabytes and unlimited calls and texts. It does everything I need it to do. Vodafone is trying to get me to upgrade constantly, but I refuse. Story 20. I like the aesthetic and ease of use and access across devices for Apple. I have used them for a long time and do not see myself switching. Story 21. Security updates are very important for phones. However, Android original equipment manufacturers only support their devices with monthly updates for about a year. After that, you are lucky to get a security update every 3 months from vendors like Samsung and OnePlus. The only exception is Pixel. For this reason, iPhone is recommended. Although I dislike the user experience, it is generally more secure and has more frequent updates on older devices. Story 22. I tried switching to Android twice and came crawling back to iPhone both times. There is something about how everything just works together: my MacBook, iPad, phone, and even my watch. Story 23. It is the ecosystem. iPhone, iPad, iMac, MacBook Pro, Apple TV. It just works. They made mistakes with artificial intelligence, but I think they are on track now. Story 24. I have always had Android. iOS is difficult to learn and restrictive like a prison. If I ever want something cracked or just to download and use anything not on the App Store, I can do it on my Samsung. Story 25. The Pixel I have cost me $300, and I have a lot of my digital life in Google products. As a public school teacher, my district uses Google Classroom and all the Google education products. The difference in camera quality does not justify spending more money on another digital ecosystem and gear. Story 26. Android gives you choices. iPhone locks you in. I had a horrible experience with the iPhone 3G and 3GS. Bad enough that I will never purchase an Apple product of any kind again. Apple took the world by storm with faulty beta products that were a decade away from being ready for mass production. Those phones were useless garbage compared to much cheaper, more reliable, feature-matching Japanese flip phones. I honestly don't know how people were convinced to choose fashion over function for the most critical device they carry on their person at all times. I didn't have to root my Android to get basic features that I use multiple times a day. I had to jailbreak those iPhones just to be able to get my work done, just to have a chance of getting notifications without having to unlock the phone. It was so bad I still feel angry about it now, and I didn't even pay for those phones. One was given to me by an employer for work, the other was a gift from a friend. I am angry because I suffered using them for all those years, maybe 5 years altogether, and I am angry that Apple is now the dominant cell phone producer worldwide. They don't deserve it. They never did. Story 27. Android's features are constantly added and updated. whereas iPhone holds those features and releases them as if they are some stroke of genius. For example, widgets. Android had them from the start, but you would think Apple created them with the marketing and promotion when they finally added them to iPhone. Features are one major factor. The second reason is Gemini Live. iPhone and Siri cannot provide instant artificial intelligence support the way Gemini Live can. It has already helped me with items I do not know much about, like fixing my son's bike and troubleshooting my truck's dying fuel pump. I do not think I could go back to iPhone after seeing what Gemini can do. Story 28. I changed to Android after the iPhone X because it was unattractive. For the past 3 years, I have been using Pixels and never considered going back. The Pixel is sleek, simple, affordable, and has a great camera. iPhones look nice, but I would never pay over $1,000 for a smartphone. That is unreasonable. Story 29. Make use of other Apple services such as shared calendar, contacts, and notes, as well as music, cloud storage, and television. I also know many shortcuts. Story 30. I have worked with cloud technologies for over a decade and have been with Apple during that time. I do not see a significant difference between the two brands to justify switching. Story 31. My husband bought an iPod back in the 2000s, and I had to put music onto it because I am the tech-savvy one. I had a generic MP3 player and thought the iPod would also be a drag-and-drop affair. It was not. Then I wanted to move everything to a Linux device. Again, that was not a problem with the generic device, but iTunes was limited to one computer only. Basically, the whole iPod and iTunes experience of the early 2000s discouraged me from purchasing any Apple products. My first smartphone was a Samsung, and I have never had a problem with them, so I will continue to buy them. Story 32. I have tried both phones over the years and have gravitated back to Android. I fell into the craze of iPhone for a while, and it was a good phone until they nickel and dimed you for everything, which I did not like. I should not have to buy a new type of charger just because I upgraded my phone to the new version and then switch it again because they realized Android had it right with the USB Type-C. I did leave Android around the Galaxy S8 phones and came back when Samsung released the Note series and have not looked back. These Note series phones, now called Ultra series, are far superior to the iPhone. You start to notice this when you see what new features Apple has been working on. I did not want to believe that Apple kind of copies Android ideas and just makes a grand reveal after a few years with something new when, in fact, Android has had that feature for years. It is somewhat frustrating. There are some features that Apple does very well compared to Android, and I think Apple's video chat is excellent and very convenient. People have their choices based on what they like, and some choose only because it is a status symbol. Apple is starting to give me Nintendo vibes, and if you are following Nintendo's new system, you will understand. Anyway, choose what you like and enjoy. Story 33. Family is in the iOS ecosystem. A message is hard to leave. If rich communication services or iMessage on Android apps get good enough by my next phone, then I will switch. Story 34. I prefer the iPhone because I have fewer issues. I dislike Samsung's operating system that they use on Android. The Google Pixel was okay, but I had more issues than with the iPhone. Additionally, if I lose Wi-Fi on my MacBook, it automatically connects to my hotspot. Story 35. iPhone support usually lasts 7 or more years. I have only owned 2 smartphones, the iPhone 6 and iPhone 12. I bought both used, and they have been very reliable. I do not care much about niche features. They do everything I need. Story 36. With Apple, because of the ecosystem, it is going to be a lot of work to move. I feel today Android is better than Apple. Samsung has better artificial intelligence integration, which is very helpful. Story 37. After using both, I realize that each has its own wonderful qualities. I respect technology and use it to its full potential. I love both. Story 38. I'm very lazy. I'm tired of having to learn to navigate new systems across the board. Lately, I miss when technology did what I wanted instead of forcing me to do what it wants. Phones used to stay right on the wall where they belonged. I'm Generation X. Excuse me while I go shake my cane and tell those kids to get off the lawn. But coincidentally, I was just researching installing non-Google search engines on one's phone. Story 39. I like having data on my phone, and Apple charges a fortune for more storage. They never have micro SD card slots, which are already hard to find on Android phones. I also have a fair number of applications at this point. Story 40. Simple reason for me. I had an original first-generation iPad which Apple decided to update to the latest operating system one day, effectively bricking it so it no longer functioned, despite it working fine up to that point. I was so incensed I have boycotted Apple products ever since. Story 41. I like deciding whether an application meets my moral and ethical standards instead of letting the company I bought the phone from make that decision for me, so I carry an Android. Story 42. Convenience mostly, but I also just like it better. I went to the iPhone after BlackBerry and stayed with the iPhone until about 2015 when I switched to Android. While the phone was fine, I encountered more issues and bugs than I ever did with my iPhone. So, I switched back in 2018 and have not looked back. Story 43. It is literally just the way the user interface looks that keeps me on iPhone. That being said, I have had Android devices in the past and they all stopped working after about a year and a half. I have never had an iPhone do that. Story 44. iPhone for life. I have used iOS for nearly my whole smart device life. I am an Apple person in general. My iPhone seamlessly works with my Mac, AirPods, and iPad. The handful of times I have tried an Android device, it always felt clunky, and I am not a fan of the overall home screen. Using a Windows PC is unpleasant. I cannot stand Windows and its unreliable software. Apple may be more expensive, but all their products just work, and that is what I like about them. Story 45. How it started, iOS ran more smoothly and looked better than Android. How it's going, I have fully embraced the Apple ecosystem with an iPhone, Mac computer, and iCloud storage. I might as well keep going. Story 46. I use Android phones, including Samsung Eternity, LG Thrill, Nexus 4, Nexus 6, Samsung S10 Plus, and Samsung S24 Ultra, because those are the only phones I have ever had. I would love to have an iPhone one day, but they are very expensive and some of the deals are not that good. I am with T-Mobile, so I could consider a trade-in after 1 year. Story 47. I live overseas and can text or video call my friends and elderly parents who do not know how to use applications for free. Story 48. I find that Samsung Android phones are just as easy to use as iOS, but with many more advantages and none of the restrictions that iOS has. I know that many Android enthusiasts dislike Samsung, but I have been a Samsung user for years. I have their watch, earphones, tablet, and even a laptop. The seamless integration for the earphones and features like copy and paste is similar to Apple, for lack of a better phrase. I pin screen captures to my screen every day. Having a pop-up calculator is immensely useful. Diagonal gestures from the edge of the screen to control smart lights or system settings bring common functions to a single touch. I am very used to it, and it works well for me. I had a work iPhone last year, which I used daily, and it was not a good experience for me, even with an open mind. There is nothing unique to the iPhone ecosystem that my Samsung Galaxy S24 Ultra cannot do. Story 49. I was into Apple as a teenager because my birth father would only swear by Apple back in the day. Nowadays, I prefer Android because, 1. It is cheaper. There are more phones available to your liking: Google, Samsung, Huawei, etc., which means broader options when you need or want to change. They all share the same cable. I have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and I never know where my cables are. Having the same cable as most of my friends and relatives helps when I do not know where I have put mine. Most of us are not rich and are not technology experts. I just want enough space to put my apps and pretty pictures. I do not need the latest super cool iPhone or phone whatsoever. I currently have the Google Pixel 7 I bought used in the local technology shop that resells used technology, and so far, I am pretty happy with it. I did not have a good experience with my used Samsung bought online. Pixels started showing up on the phone panel and hurting my eyes. I could only use it for less than 6 months before having to buy another one. Story 50. I was a lifelong Android user until 2021, when the iPhone 13 was released. I switched from the Samsung Galaxy S10 Plus to the iPhone 13 because I got bored of Android and wanted something new. I also switched to fit in with everyone else. Currently, I am using the iPhone 15 Pro, Apple Watch Series 7, and AirPods Pro 2nd generation. I am now fully invested in the Apple ecosystem with no plans to switch back. Story 51. I am a technician. I dislike Apple's closed ecosystem and their "you have to do it our way" mentality. I have always been able to make the changes I want in the ways I want on Android and easily connect to and work with Windows or Linux devices. Apple is much better with this now, but I still want to avoid the frustration of hitting limitations and the high cost of their hardware compared to what you get. Story 52. Well, I wanted to choose Apple because Apple devices actually retain their value better. However, I had to stick with an Android device since Android devices do not hold their value as well. Samsung offers rebates if you trade in your Samsung device. Story 53. I dislike all Apple products because a faulty Mac laptop let me down in graduate school. Therefore, I use an Android device and am very happy with it. Story 54. My mom has an iPhone, and every time I have used her phone to help with something, such as connecting to Wi-Fi, I have been frustrated by the lack of a back button and the difficulty of closing tabs or apps that are already open. I have a Samsung, and the user interface is much easier. I do not understand why some people say iPhones are easy to use because they are not intuitive to me like Android devices are. Story 55. I already bought and invested in multiple Android applications. Some applications are not even available on iOS. My wife tried to convince me to switch to iPhone since she has one and I have a MacBook as well. My parents also use iPhones, but I am a rare customer who uses the S Pen from Samsung often. Currently, I have a OnePlus and kind of miss the S Pen. I am going to switch again next year to Samsung and probably use Samsung DeX as well. It seems like a cool feature, something that iOS is missing. Story 56. I used Android for years because it was inexpensive. My wife convinced me to join her phone plan since it would have been slightly cheaper than having two separate plans, and I received a free iPhone as part of the deal. Fast forward to now, and I have years of experience with both iPhone and Android. In my opinion, they are essentially the same with only minor differences in the user interface. The only feature iPhone has over Android is FaceTime, but Android users have access to many video chatting applications. Ultimately, it comes down to whether you prefer pressing a button or swiping. Story 57. The iPhone makes compatibility with other devices complicated. I switched to it and disliked it the entire time. I lost even more respect for Apple enthusiasts and their blue bubble superiority complex after trying it myself. Samsung flagship phones are my choice from now on. Story 58. iPhone here. Several points. I don't worry about the hardware being left out of software updates. Yes, I am aware of Google Pixel, but here in the United States, Android is still tied to the phone carrier's whims. They want to sell more phones, so they have little interest in a 3 or 4 year cycle. The hardware stack, even after 3 years, is great. I don't feel I am missing much. My use case does not see my phone draining its battery in a single day. There are likely items like faster charging or bigger batteries that Android would have that I don't need. Family and friends mostly have iPhones. This makes the integration better, though the rich communication services iMessage update would make me less queasy about a shift to Android if I wanted. This was the reason I switched back from Android to Apple 6 years ago. iMessage just hated third-party texts. I think we are at a plateau in general for phone hardware. Android or Apple, we all carry pocket supercomputers that keep us connected anywhere we go. Story 59. Android. YouTube revanced. YouTube Music revanced. Reddit revanced. F-Droid and a few other non-Play Store apps. Easier and more customization. iOS features seem to be years behind compared to Android. I use Gmail, Google Drive, and Google Photos. Cheaper depending on the phone. Story 60. I can watch YouTube with dislike counter and sponsor skip function. I can also install whatever else I like. Story 61. Android gives me access to Android Package Kit applications, which are important to me. Applications like YouTube Revanced and Mihan are things that I would rather not live without. Plus, I am just used to the user interface on Android, so I do not really care to switch. Story 62. I had HTC at first, switched to Apple, and hated the restrictions. I moved to Android because of the customization options and never looked back. Yes, I know Apple now allows customization, but it is too little, too late. They hold back features and then present them as new and innovative when Android has had them for several years. Story 63. I had always been a person who said, I will never own a Mac. They are overpriced. While I still agree they are overpriced, now that I have one, the simple fact that I can have AirPods in, play something on my phone, and then play something on my computer and it just works seamlessly is impressive. I do not think I could leave the ecosystem. Story 64. I always prefer Android. I find it has a better operating system and is easy to use. The only downside I found is that I cannot use Spotify to play my favorite music. Story 65. It's expensive to change phones, so unless my company is paying for it, I will use what I have until it breaks. I have had a BlackBerry, iPhone, and I am currently using a Samsung Galaxy S24 Ultra. Story 66. I stick with Android because I prefer to use open source software and want to have control over my device. For example, I cannot develop an application for my iPhone without paying money to Apple and without using a Mac OS device to sign it. For Android, I can develop for free on any device. That is the reason why there are many free and open source applications for Android but not so many for iPhone. Story 67. I have always disliked Apple Incorporated, mainly because Steve Jobs gave off strong negative vibes. I have never knowingly paid a single cent to that company in my life. Story 68. Android is a brand new smartphone that lets me easily use the file system and install any applications I want. My phone was $35 brand new, and I can play any 1080p streaming video or Nintendo 64 or PlayStation games for free very easily. Apple's user interface is also very unintuitive to me. Once you have found something, you remember it, but how was I to know that dragging a window halfway up would show all of the active programs? Story 69. Android, because it is not tied in, has an open app marketplace, no ads on free YouTube, and I have never subscribed, so there is nothing to lose. Mostly, it offers the freedom to use any phone, watch, or PC I want. Story 70. iPhones offer a smooth, secure ecosystem, while Android provides more customization and a wider range of devices. Story 71. iPhones are just simpler to use. If I need to use a more sophisticated interface, I will use my Windows personal computer. For everyday tasks, I prefer my iPhone. Story 72. The ecosystem. I have become an Apple enthusiast and I enjoy it currently: phone, watch, laptop, AirPod synergy. Story 73. iPhone longevity and maintenance are excellent. A 7-year-old iPhone still works perfectly with the latest operating system version and shows no drop in performance. Story 74. I love the Apple ecosystem where everything syncs to my iPad and MacBook, with way less bloatware compared to Android devices. Story 75. No average phone user needs to spend more than $400 to $500 on a device. This is why Android tends to be sufficient. I typically recommend Pixel phones to anyone who wants an average but premium-feeling phone that will last and does not care for specifics. iPhones are good but overpriced. I do not like the ecosystem of Apple products you are coerced into. For me, iPhones are only better if you want to record content, as they are excellent for that. Story 76. I had Android first. It irritated me to no end. It seemed like nobody developing for that ecosystem cared about details. iOS is not perfect either, but it is much closer. Also, I am a Mac user and everything integrates very nicely. Story 77. Had an iPhone from 2008 to 2013, then switched to the Samsung Galaxy Note series until 2017. In general, Android was slow and unreliable and frequently showed, unfortunately, the app has stopped messages. My daughter was on her first horseback ride, and I missed the photo because the camera app kept crashing. I was very frustrated, so we drove straight to Verizon, and I switched back to iPhone and have not looked back. I also support a fleet of 100 devices at work, so I still use test Android devices, but in general, they are still problematic. I do not understand why typing and keyboard lag occur in 2025. Story 78. Android user here. First, I hate the whole Apple ecosystem. I don't know if iTunes is still required to put music on your phone, but that was absurd. There is no reason you shouldn't be able to drag and drop music like anyone who has used a file system is capable of doing, and I shouldn't have to install bloated software to do so. I also hate how Apple is notoriously stubborn when it comes to using any kind of standard. At least they finally adopted USB-C and rich communication services messaging, but it took them much longer than it should have. Apple purposefully slowing down the operating system was another big issue that turned me off. I had multiple iPhones that went from functioning perfectly to basically becoming useless after an iOS update. That alone made me say forget Apple forever. I am a developer, and I think it is unfair that you cannot develop for iPhones without an Apple product. I did it for a little while with macOS running in a virtual machine called Hackintosh, but I got tired of dealing with operating system upgrades, so I stopped developing for iOS. I am not going to buy another expensive rig just to develop for iOS when everything else I do does not require it. I haven't seen anything I would say iPhones do better than my Android Galaxy S22, other than maybe the pictures. I don't understand when people say Android is harder to use. Having used both, they are equally easy to use in my opinion. They are a little different, but obviously if you use something you are not used to, it will seem more difficult than what you are familiar with. Story 79. The ecosystem lock-in is real with Apple, but I totally understand the appeal of Android's flexibility. Being able to sideload apps and use custom tools like virtual private networks is a game changer. Personally, I would hate to lose all my paid apps and data if I switched platforms. At the end of the day, it is all about what trade-offs you are willing to make for convenience versus freedom. Story 80. I am not spending thousands on an iPhone when my $200 A13 does the same job. There is a very large range of applications on Android, which is great if you're looking for more applications relating to obscure topics. Also, I dislike the entire Apple interface. I find it incredibly hard to use. Story 81. Android is much cheaper and performs excellently. I need something that works reliably at a good price. Only one option meets these criteria. Story 82. I am too lazy to learn a new system, and my whole family uses iPhones. We chat with iMessage. Also, I have a MacBook and an Apple Watch. Story 83. I stick with Android for the price. Having previously owned an iPhone, switching between them is a pain, especially to get my iCloud email. Story 84. I like the way Android works, and I am not willing to pay 2 or 3 times more for something that is not better just to get the Apple name. Story 85. I absolutely fell in love with the Gold Rose iPhone 8, but before and after that, it was Android because it functioned better in my opinion. They need to bring back Blackberries, to be honest. I miss my BlackBerry Bold. Story 86. The first Android device I had, Sony Arc codename Inzu. I was able to easily root without any issues, change systems, install any apps, and more. The same applies to Google Nexus 4, which was my next device. Playing Pokemon Go with spoof GPS, catching them in Central Park while sitting at work in an office in Europe was fun. This is why I use Android and personal computers instead of iPhone and Macintosh computers. Freedom to do whatever I want with my devices is important. There is no such freedom with iOS. Story 87. I stick with Android. The iPhone price is just not worth it. I do not like how restrictive iOS is when it comes to installing apps. iPhones are great, but for that price, you are not really buying a phone anymore. You are buying the feeling of having status, and I do not need Apple for that. Story 88. If you use the car analogy, you can either buy a specific model from one manufacturer, such as the iPhone, or you can buy any other make or model, such as an Android device. Story 89. I have a relative with an Apple phone who wanted to fix or change the battery. Apple said they could not fix it and suggested buying a new one. A local phone repair shop fixed it in 20 minutes. Story 90. Same reason I still use Microsoft Windows. Customization and trying new applications because my job involves a lot of testing and integrations. I am not a technology specialist, by the way. Story 91. I have always envied having an iPhone because I was stuck with a low-tier Android throughout high school. My first real job, I bought myself an iPhone XR and have had an iPhone since. The only thing that slightly tempts me to Android is the better availability of emulators. Story 92. Really intrigued by the coherence of iOS and the raw camera performance, but I just love the options and independence of my Google Pixel. I sideload patched YouTube applications to extend base functionality, have a good camera, and can transfer files on my phone in USB mode without needing any management software in between, such as audiobooks, occasional project files, or photo selections I have stored locally. I have an iPad mini too, which still works and has decent battery life, though it is slow and barely supported by applications. Back then, every application created its own copy of a file to work with it. Is that still the case today? Story 93. My mom owns an Android device, and I do not know if it is because I have used iOS for more than 10 years, but I find Android's interface badly designed and awkward to navigate. Story 94. I have had an iPhone XS and I disliked it. The battery performed poorly, it was very fragile, and it experienced more bugs than normal operation. It is safe to say that I will never buy an iPhone again. Story 95. Android devices are more intuitive to me, and you have access to more of the phone's features. They are cheaper, technologically up-to-date, and of better quality in my opinion. I also dislike Apple as a company. The iPhone operating system has an aesthetically pleasing user interface, but it often feels like a child's toy compared to the Android or Linux user interfaces. It seems that iPhones are designed to appeal to non-technical users, based on the user interface, settings placement, and app restrictions. I have owned 2 iPhones in my life but have not looked back since switching to Android. Story 96. Used to be that Android feels better to me, more flexible, can do lots of extra stuff. I have recently added one more reason though, foldable phones. I love the massive foldable screen, and if I get the chance, I do not want to go back to a regular phone. Story 97. Android devices are generally much cheaper. Not everyone can spend around $3,000 on a new high-end phone every year. Story 98. My very first phone was a Samsung. Along the way, I found that I prefer the Android system more than iOS, with all its freedoms that the iPhone may not have. Story 99. iPhone users often act superior about the new model phones, and I prefer not to be associated with them. Combine that with Apple's strong anti-repair policies, and I will never shop at their stores again, even if they change their approach. Story 100. More options and settings for customization. User interface and ease of use are better. Can easily transfer movies and television shows from my personal computer. Almost always cheaper for the same or better specifications. Easily emulate everything from Game Boy to Nintendo Switch games. Story 101. iPhone is overrated and overpriced. I can buy 12 decent Android phones for the price of one iPhone and do not have to deal with Apple's poor customer care. Story 102. I chose Android because root access in early Android versions seemed easier than in iOS. Now I am used to Android with no real issues. Additionally, repurchasing apps on iOS would be an unnecessary extra cost. Story 103. I see no real advantage in buying an iPhone. Never have. The significantly higher price does not justify what seem to me to be negligible differences. Story 104. I have been using iOS since the original iPod Touch. iOS feels more intuitive to me, and I still have all my content from the first iPod. It also works conveniently with my family, who all use iOS and share an iCloud family account, as well as with AirPods. The price is reasonable compared to Android flagship phones. Story 105. I think both phones are good for their intended purpose. From a technical point of view, I prefer Android since iPhones are very limited. I can do a lot more with Android devices. However, iPhones are easy to use and are for users who do not want to bother with the technical side of things. Story 106. I just experienced my iPhone being too old for the new iOS. I can no longer use some of the applications because they require me to update the applications, which can only be updated if you have the latest iOS. However, I switched to Android a few weeks ago. I was planning to keep using my iPhone for games and other activities, but it seems that soon I cannot. Story 107. While I do like Android, I am at the point where I have invested so much with Apple over the years, including watch, phone, and MacBook, that transitioning to Android would be too much of a hassle for me. Story 108. Honestly, I am just used to the Android layout and knowing where all the buttons are. I am beyond the whole tribalism concept. Now, it is just a matter of comfort. I have been using Android since the beginning, and it is just what I am accustomed to. Story 109. Price. My personal phone was an inexpensive Android. I received an iPhone 15 from my work, and I like this one as well. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.